Welcome to the Animal Training Academy podcast show. I'm your host, Ryan Cartledge, and I'm passionate about helping you master your animal training skills using the most positive and least intrusive approach. Here at ATA, we understand that navigating the vast challenges you encounter in training requires a comprehensive base of knowledge and experience. It's common to face obstacles and rough patches on your journey that can leave you feeling totally overwhelmed and stressed. Therefore, since 2015, we've been on a mission to empower animal trainers worldwide. We've aided thousands in developing their skills, expanding their knowledge, boosting their confidence, and maximizing their positive impact on all the animal and human learners they work with. And we're excited to do the same for you. Simply visit www.atamember.com, join our vibrant community, and geek out with us. And of course, in the meantime, enjoy this free podcast episode as we explore new ways to help you supercharge your training skills, grow your knowledge, and build your confidence so that you can craft a life that positively impacts every learner you encounter. Well, we will start today's episode where we are excited to welcome back to the podcast for part 2 of our conversation, Francesca Degli Espinosa. And if you haven't listened to the first part of our conversation, you can find it as the previous episode on whatever app you're listening to this show on. In that episode, we explored Francesca's journey in getting a dog and what that was like as an experienced behaviour analysis and her current deep dive into animal training. So it's definitely worth a listen. However, if you haven't listened to it yet, you are, of course, welcome to stay here with part 2, where you will still gain plenty of insights to help you grow your skills, knowledge, and confidence in animal training. So let's dive in. Francesca's journey in ABA, Applied Behaviour Analysis, began with a child with autism who had limited words, shaping her career. She became the lead clinician for the first UK-based EIBI outcome study and earned a PhD in psychology under Professor Bob Remington at the University of Southampton. Currently, Francesca focuses on translating cognitive insights into a technology to help children with autism. Her work centers on early social responsiveness, generative verbal behavior, and theory of mind. In 2023, she received the Clinical Supervisor Award in Verbal Behavior from ABAI. She runs a diagnostic clinic in the UK and teaches advanced behavior analysis in Italy, the UK, and the US. Francesca is a board member of the B.F. Skinner Foundation and a student in the KPA Professional Program. She lives in Southampton, UK with her husband, one of her 3 sons preparing for university, and her 2 dogs who inspire her to be a better behaviour analyst. So without further ado, it's my very great pleasure to welcome Francesca back to the show today. Francesca, thank you so much for taking even more time to come and hang out with us at Animal Training Academy.
Thank you. It's great to be here again.
Can't wait to dive into this episode. Now, you listeners, this is a little bit of a backstory for this episode. When Francesca and I caught up to discuss this episode last week, she started explaining her current work and I was captivated by what she had to share. It sounded incredibly interesting and I found myself curious to learn more. So I thought I would take this opportunity to explore my curiosities and invite all of you to come on this journey with us. Francesca, could you please delve into your current work and the exciting things that you're involved in right now? I'm curious, maybe we can start with, what does translation of cognitive and developmental description of key processes in language and childhood development into an analysis of controlling variables mean?
Yeah. I guess we need to go back to my sort of early schooling. I was an undergraduate at Goldsmiths College, University of London, and the department is well known. It's a well-known psychology department. But as most sort of departments now, the emphasis is on cognitive neuroscience or developmental approaches, and behaviorism, that's how it's generally called and referred to, is taught as a historically important period in the development of psychology as science, but that has no longer any relevance because we can now, behavior is what we do and say is better understood by making reference to cognitive processes. And that was my early schooling. In fact, all my years at university, that's what I'd been taught. But at the same time, I was working with kids with autism, and the kids were learning a lot of skills, particularly, I will call it language for now, and later I'll switch to verbal behavior. But they were learning to label things, they were learning to discriminate verbal instructions. So, if you said get a cup, they got a cup, and where's the shoe? And they point to the shoe. So they were picking up skills through a very specific way of teaching that I was taught by the supervisors in charge of the children's educational programs. And, I remember towards the end of my degree, speaking to a very well-known autism researcher who happened to be also my tutor, my undergraduate tutor. And he said, "Oh, I'm really glad you're working with kids with autism. You can change their behavior, but you can't change their thinking." And I didn't understand what he said. I just didn't have the words. So that you can change what they do, but you can't change, what's inside. And certainly you can't teach them, to take on someone else's perspective, which is what can be commonly described as stereo mind. And I was like, okay, whatever. I mean, I'm, having a great time with the kids. But at the end of my degree, I was offered a chance to do a PhD in the psychology department on, a topic, a branch of my choice. And the ones that were offered were mainly cognitive developmental, which was, something I've always loved, particularly the developmental aspect, how children learn. When do they learn and why do they learn this way? And the answers were always about the developing brain, hitting certain milestones at a certain age. And I was fine with those explanations. But I did love what I was doing with the kids because I could see they were picking up skills. And I kind of wanted to continue it, but I couldn't quite figure out how what I was doing related back to the sort of complexity of human behavior, right? Am I teaching kids to think, or am I just teaching them to respond? That was the one question. And it's a badly formulated question, but bear in mind, I was 22. I didn't really know behavior analysis. I could do things to get kids to respond. But I always thought, it seems that I'm having to teach every single response individually. Like I'm having to establish a reinforcement history for every single behavior. And that was in contrast with what I was experiencing at home with my son. I had a child very, very young. I was pregnant at 18, barely 19. I had a son And uh, and some of the kids I was working with had many more words than he had. I mean, he was maybe 18 months, 20 months, maybe had 30 to 50 words within the typical range. But the kids I was working with had vocabularies of 400, 500 words. But the one thing that always struck me was he would learn a new word. Half the time, he would come up with many novel words that I didn't know how he picked up. Where did he learn that? How did he learn to say that? And I'm and this was in contrast with the kids I was working with, who would only learn something new if I specifically reinforced it, if I specifically taught it. Again, my verbal behavior about what I was doing wasn't behavioral. I didn't have that repertoire yet. But I couldn't reconcile these two things, how fast that, does this mean that I would have to teach every instance, every permutation of the emission of that particular word in every single context? When I was looking at my son, and if he learned chair that day, he would use it to request for a chair when he needed it. He would use it to point to a chair in a book or in a video. And if I said, hey, what do you sit on? And he would say chair. And I'm like, is there something about the kids I'm working with that is different? And so the answers I had from some of my supervisors at the time, this is a long time ago. Okay, so this is 1999. So we have moved on as a behavioral science in terms of how we teach. But I'm like this, I just couldn't reconcile the two things. And I thought, well, the answers I had then were, it's an autism problem. So it's autism is a problem with generalization. Kids with autistic children don't generalize. So you do have to teach every instance. And I accepted that explanation. But I didn't see the point. What is the point of doing all this if you have to teach to generate that, call it topography, in every context? And so I thought, well, maybe my colleagues, my professors at University are right. Behaviorism is dead. It just can't go beyond what you see and what has a specific reinforcement history. And if that were the case, how do you explain the language explosion that kids undergo between 16 and 22 months? Where it would be difficult to find specific instances of teaching for every single utterance. And of course, many people have had this question. I'm not the only one. And most of the times when I think I've found a great question or a great answer, someone else has already thought about it, written a paper about it, and done 5 different studies. So my thoughts were not in any way original. And I didn't know where to look because I had just finished university. I couldn't quite formulate the questions the way I can now. And so I thought, well, my professors are right. I'll take the offer. But I loved working with the kids, so I wanted to continue doing that. And it just so happened that a fellow New Zealander from a professor at Keele University, Oliver Matford, he's back in New Zealand now, said actually, and I won't tell you a long story about how I ended up contacting him, but I said, look, I understand you are looking maybe for PhD students to look into early intensive behavioral intervention. He said, yeah, you would need to move to the middle of nowhere. So no, I can't really live London. I said, I don't know what to do. I just don't understand how I can reconcile these two things, the effectiveness of what I'm doing, but also the limitations of what I'm doing and what I know about typical development. And he said, why don't you read this book? And it was a book by Hank Schlinger on a behavioral perspective, a behavior analysis of child development. And then I thought, wow, this makes sense. And I could only really understand about 25% because I didn't have all an analysis of behavior is not easy. It looks easy at the outset. You think, oh, it's ABC. Well, there's a little bit more than that. And so it's very hard to explain complex behavior and being parsimonious at the same time, only employing the principles available to an analysis of behavior. It is much easier to invoke new explanations, okay, that are outside. And so we look for internal entities. Okay, the child can't pass this test because he or they have the lack theory of mind. And how do you know the lack theory of mind? Because they can't pass this test. And he, in the book, Hank Schlinger describes, in terms of basic principles and analysis of behavior, some pretty complex, the emergence of pretty complex behavior. And I wanted to learn more because I didn't get everything he said, but I could tell there was something there. There were important lessons to be learned about how kids learn. And I took a job. I took a job with a research program that offered to train me as an ABA supervisor. This is a long time ago, the BACB. We had no certification. At the time, there were no masters in Europe where you could learn behavior analysis. So I had no educational path in front of me. I could only learn it through doing, but the theoretical part, the part that I found really interesting, I couldn't quite find a way to be educated in it. And I read a couple of books by Skinner by then. This was early 2000. The most accessible ones, like Beyond Freedom and Dignity and About Behaviorism, that's sort of a bit more accessible to an audience who doesn't have a background in experimental analysis of behavior. I tried behavioral organisms. I couldn't understand the thing. I tried verbal behavior. And that journey ended by page 10. And so, but I took this job and I learned there how to program. So how to break a skill down into manageable units and prompt and differentially reinforce, which is pretty much how we did it back then. But the people that really knew their stuff, and so they could figure things out pretty quickly, change something, and then the child would respond towards the path that they had originally designed. So it was a great learning experience. I got to work with lots of different kids, but those questions were still there for me because I was still teaching one response after another. And then, by complete chance, as most things in my career, because I don't look for opportunities that kind of land on my lap, or I would say there've been a series of happy encounters or happy accidents, happy events. But I recognize, I'm pretty good at recognizing when something is worth pursuing. And by then, this is 2000, late 2000, beginning of 2001, early intensive behavioral intervention was really picking up in the UK. Families were lobbying heavily the local authorities to provide funding. They were taking the local authorities to tribunals, winning at tribunals, because they could show that their kids were learning through this approach, which at the time was mainly home-based. It was mainly parent-run with the supervision of external consultants, and then the parents would hire students who would implement the one-to-one sessions after having been given training. And so it was the local authorities, 11 local authorities got together and commissioned a big study to the University of Southampton. This was a multi-million-pound study with about 22 kids receiving early intensive behavioral intervention delivered by the university team, and 22 kids receiving treatment as usual. So whatever was available at the time in the UK, which did not include EIBI, early intensive behavioral intervention. And I applied for the job, and I got the job as the senior clinical supervisor for the research, for the clinical team in the research, which meant that I was responsible for developing a curriculum, design a curriculum from very early skills all the way up to complex skills such as conversation, make it developmentally sequenced, and I had help, obviously, by the Professor Remington, and training the supervisors and leading basically the clinical intervention. So it was a monumental task. And I still had this nagging question, and I had more experience by then, which was, how do I design something that produces generative learning? So learning that is novel, as in the response the child gives does not have a specific reinforcement history. And that then led me to really, really study behavior analysis and particularly verbal behavior. I received a lot of help from a couple of great mentors, Vince Carbone, Dr. Dave Palmer, who really shaped my verbal behavior. But the thing that came with the study was to do a PhD at the same time. And the great thing about PhD in the UK is that you don't go to class. You just run your own research. With obviously heavily supervised, but you ask the questions, you design the studies, and you run the studies, and everything has to link back to theory. And so when you're dealing with trying to establish something as complex as verbal behavior, and verbal behavior is generative by definition, really. Now I'm engaging verbal behavior, but the combination of verbal topographies that I'm producing, I may not have produced before. How do you explain that? And secondly, how do you establish that? And then it sort of took me into trying to find in the literature what was being said, not just about language acquisition, but things like imitation and joint attention, play, because the curriculum that we devised and needed to design had to be comprehensive. It had to include all relevant developmental domains. That's what comprehensive behavioral intervention is. And all these things had to work together. And so my question was, what is the underlying principle here that unifies all these skills? There must be a minimum common denominator. And that's what really my PhD, came to be. And so translating, cognitive and developmental descriptions of behavior, because that's what they are, into an analysis of controlling variables means providing explanations. Is understanding, once you understand the controlling variables for a phenomenon, you can manipulate them to establish it, provided you have the relevant prerequisites. But understanding the relevant controlling variables for a repertoire is difficult behaviorally because we have few principles. And so how do you explain the naming explosion when kids seem to be acquiring 20 words, new words a week, behaviorally? So that's what it means. And, if we can break it down, something like joint attention, into its operations, then we can replicate those and derive procedures that would establish a skill under the natural source of control, under its natural contingencies, rather than being simply a topography.
So how do you explain it?
How do I explain it? Oh, right. So let's say joint attention. Joint attention is an interesting one because it's what would be called pre-verbal, as in it doesn't require words. And in fact, it happens around 9 months. Your daughter is too young. She's 9 weeks, but she's already engaging in a lot of early social responding. A lot of it. So do you know much about joint attention? Like, how do you think about it? Have you ever thought about it? Okay.
No, that's the answer.
Okay, fine. But you know what? You have a lot of experience with it because, so your 4-year-old daughter, think back when she was probably, 10 months, about 10 months. And you have a dog, is that right? Do you recall a time where your daughter looked at the dog, looked at you, pointed to something funny maybe the dog was doing, looked back at you to check that you were looking at the same thing, and then you said, oh yeah, they are doing this. Oh yeah, look, they're whatever, they're chasing their tail. I don't know, whatever. Or I don't know, maybe you were walking down the park and she heard a noise coming from the sky and she kind of looks up and she looks at you and she points towards the item and then looks back at you to check that you're looking at the same thing. And then you say, yeah, that's an airplane. Can you recall instances like that?
I think so.
Yeah. Yeah. They happen so frequently in a child's first year of life, first and second year, that you stop thinking about it because they're not extraordinary. They happen all the time. So we would say that joint attention is the child is monitoring the mutual gaze to an event, right? So it's also called kind of triangulation or social triangulation. And the explanations that are given in the sort of traditional cognitive developmental realm is that the child is monitoring the mental state of attention. Okay. And they don't provide an analysis of the controlling variables. And while they describe what happens, which is there's an interesting event to the child wants to share that with the parent. So they look at the parent and guide their gaze towards that event. That's a description of what happens, but it's not an analysis, right? So an analysis would say there's an event, okay? So there's a change in the environment that establishes the value of attention, okay, as a reinforcer. Value of attention of the parent in an individual for whom attention has functioned as a social attention has functioned as a reinforcer. Okay. So how do we know when someone is, that's a bad term, paying attention, but how do we know when someone is paying attention to something? What do they do?
So you said for an individual where social attention has functioned as a reinforcer.
Yeah.
But you also said, and this is, I'm just clarifying for my understanding here and the listeners, that the function of that behavior being look at the interesting event, look towards the human.
I didn't say the function. I said that's how we describe the topography.
That's how we would describe it. And you said that it's establishing the value of attention.
Yes.
But it's
so
also
you need to look at it. So let's unpack it. Look at the chain. The chain is an event, a change in the environment. That's what a stimulus change. Okay. Remember, the environment changes all the time. So something happens. The child contacts that change. Contacts means comes into contact with it. Okay. That event requires information, right? Because it's unusual. Okay. It may be a new animal, something. So it becomes relevant to seek information regarding that item, that change. Where does information come from in typically developing infants? Generally, the parent. Okay. But to make sure that they get information, they need to get the parent to contact that event. So they're going to engage in behavior, okay, that produces the parent's gaze onto that same event. Okay. And so what they would do is they would turn, look at the parent. The looking behavior is reinforced by meeting the parent's eye. And then they would guide the parent with a point, quite typically if the item is distant, or show if it's in their hand. And then the parent would then say, and what the infant is doing is monitoring that eye movement of the parent to the item, back to them. And then the parent would say, oh yeah, it's an elephant. Okay. So this is a description. It is not a functional description so far. I've just described a series of events, right? That's one level of analysis. Okay, let's look at the controlling variables. Event that alters the value of attention as a reinforcer. Okay, it is only a reinforcer for an individual for whom it is a reinforcer. Okay, social attention is often not a reinforcer in, for example, kids with autism. But we're talking in this case, we're providing an analysis of a developmental milestone. So event establishes the value of attention as a reinforcer. It doesn't necessarily make it available. We need a stimulus that's correlated with the availability of that reinforcer, right? So the child, which is the parent, so the child is going to turn towards the parent, that's behavior, and look at the parent's eyes, that's the behavior. What's the reinforcer? Is meeting the parent's eye, okay? Once they do that, they point to the item. These two behaviors come very quickly together, okay? So we can say looking and pointing at the same time. And the ultimate reinforcer is the parent looking at the same thing. So they then need to look at the parent and then look back at the event and at the parent to meet that reinforcer, okay? And that completes the chain. The parent then gives them information, right? It's an elephant. That's an analysis of the controlling variables. I wish I'd come up with it. I did not. It's a brilliant paper by Bill Dubey. But this is what an analysis of behavior can do. It can provide an analysis of the variables that evoke that behavior and alter or reduce the value of a reinforcer, and provides a full four-term contingency. And the beauty of it is that if we can do that, if we understand the controlling variables, then we can create a technology that harnesses that and brings behavior under the natural sources of control. So if we want to establish joint attention functionally, not just as a topography, because as a topography, you could, and we used to do this, which is not great, but we would present something, prompt the child to point, prompt the child to look back, and then, say the word and give them some kind of reinforcer, generally food or toy. It looks like joint attention, but the controlling variables are not the same words that would establish and maintain that behavior in the natural environment. Right? That's what I love to study and try to generate in my research, which is, let's look at this fundamental process. Let's break it down in terms of, let's analyze it in terms of controlling variables, unpack it, put it back together procedurally, so that when we establish behavior, we establish it under the relevant sources of control, and we don't fall prey to the criticism that we just teach rote responses.
That makes sense. Thank you for explaining all of that. And well done on answering my initial question by taking us back and building our understanding slowly. I appreciated that. I was grateful for it. This isn't necessarily related to you. I just feel gratitude as you were talking because I get to, as a podcast host, have these interesting conversations with all of these people around the world. And so grateful that we get to take you, the listener, with us on this journey. I'm curious then, now, you've explained all that. But before I share that my curiosity, congratulations as well on getting that role where you had to create this program,
Yeah.
which sounds incredibly exciting, but I can imagine also at times would have been overwhelming.
It was overwhelming. I think if I was offered that job today, gosh, 23 years later, knowing everything I know, in terms of what it takes to manage a team, to work collaboratively with people, I would say no. But I was young and, I had that. I'm glad I was offered a job when I was young because, I had that enthusiasm, that drive. Yes, we're going to change the world. We're going to change how, uh, you know, children are taught in this country. And, the study was very successful. It had some impact, but parents still fight for this. But yeah, it was very exciting at the same time. And I learned a ton, but I also what learned what my weaknesses were. And my weaknesses and my strengths. I like working with the kids. I love working with the kids. I love teaching people, but I don't like having an employer. And I don't like, I like to kind of shape my own environment. I do, I think I said it in the previous session. I don't follow instructions very well unless everything is operationally defined. And so I resist rules. That might be being Italian as well. But I learned that it was important to me to be able to to chart my own path, to make my to take the merits and the responsibility for the mistakes. And so I left what may have turned out eventually to be an academic position. And there were some tough years. I kind of slowly built up my clinical work privately. And then I just had a couple of just lucky meetings where someone heard me speak and they invited me to speak at a ABAI. And then it's kind of built from there. So now I knew I wanted to do only what I loved. And that's what I've been doing since 2004, is working with families, working directly with the kids. I still go down to the floor and play, sit at a table when necessary and teach. I, give talks when people ask me to, and just have a great time being a behavior analyst, doing behavior analysis.
So the question you had early on in your
Mm,
studies and
yeah,
the practical application you were doing with the kids at that time, whilst your firstborn was 18
yeah.
months ish old,
Mhm.
around how you can teach behaviors that are generalized between contexts. Have I worded that correct?
It's a little bit more than that. It's about how do I arrange my teaching contingencies so I only teach a sufficient number of responses and I get novel, untrained, untaught responses. So, somewhat different from the traditional way of thinking of generalization. That's what generative learning is novel members of a class that haven't been previously reinforced. So my question was, can it be done? Does it exist? And yes, I mean, I wasn't the only one answering the trying to ask and answer this question. Many others, notable behavior analysts, have addressed this question and attempted to answer it.
So, where are you now with your feelings about the answers or
I
lack
think
of
we are pretty,
answers
yeah,
you've
I think we are. The question is an analysis of behavior, is an analysis of generative behavior that remains faithful solely to behavioral principles. Is it possible? Yes. That and includes pretty much most all complex human behavior. It's all part of our subject matter. It just requires a lot of, sometimes it's hard, those analyses are hard to understand because you need very good verbal behavior about basic principles. But is it possible? Yes. Can we then derive a technology to bring such complex behavior, to establish such complex behavior in individuals that don't, for which it is not selected by the social environment? We're still looking for those answers. Some we have some pretty successful technologies. And for other repertoires, we obviously are still in the early stages of sometimes generating the analysis and then generating the interventions. But we made really good progress. We teach in a very different way now in ABA compared to what we did 30 years ago. We have much more, we have a greater commitment to being conceptually systematic rather than just technological. Understanding the underlying mechanism behind the procedures. And we know how to arrange skills sequentially in some skills, not all, in such a way that novel skills will come. And we're doing much more on that and much better than we did 30 years ago. But, you know, we're always learning and, you know, do we have a complete account? I think we have the tools to achieve it. And I think, you know, it's hard because there are so many aspects. Behavior is complex. Complex, I don't mean complicated. It is, behavior analysis is complicated, but complex is that it's made of multiple parts. Okay. And it changes moment to moment. And so to account for all those changes, the variability is, and the generativity of human behavior, by sticking to basic principles, it is a difficult task. It is not impossible. There's some clever people who, can explain phenomena such as memory, which was thought to be only the subject for cognitive psychology. They can explain it. They can provide a strong behavioral interpretation for it without ever referring to a hidden cognitive structure that is completely unobservable other than through the behavior that you're trying to explain, from which you infer the existence of a cognitive structure.
Well, I find myself in the same position as I did at the end of our last conversation, and that is with much more questions than I have time to ask. I think for the listeners of this episode, we'll leave it there though, because we could keep going. We'll leave it there though, because I think there's lots to chew on from everything you've shared with us today. I'm curious, I love to ask this question of all of our guests. You've enrolled and are currently partaking in the Karen Pryor Professional Dog Training Certification, which you have expressed you're thoroughly enjoying. And you've shared with us, the listeners of this show, over the last 2 episodes about your background and what you've been up to for the last 30 years of your life. From where you're sitting, entering into the conversation with animal trainers, building relationships, growing your skill set and knowledge, and applying the skill set and knowledge that you have to non-human learners, what do you want to see happen in our community over the next 5 to 10 years?
I think I would like to see better communications between human behavior analysts who work with human learners and behavior analysts who work with non-human learners. I think the behavior analysts who work with non-human learners can teach us a lot about establishing behavior. They bring a level of precision that we, I think, often lack. And in a way, I think that's what I would like to see. I would like to see our community of behavior analysts working with human learners learn more from the behavior analysts working with the non-human learners. If I can kind of reverse your question a little bit, is I think we have a lot to learn from the people like Eva, people like Chirac, Hannah Brannigan, Kiki Yablon, Sarah Irwing. They understand stimulus control in a way that we sometimes don't, or we do, but we're sloppy with our procedures because we can prompt. And this idea of offer behavior, which is a term that is mainly used in the animal world, in the clicker training world, It's not a word that we use. And sometimes we use the word spontaneous behavior, which I've always been uneasy with, because behavior is behavior and all behavior is under stimulus control. But even offer behavior is, otherwise it wouldn't be behavior. But this idea that you can create a loop of events that makes the behavior more probable through clever reinforcement placement, clever antecedent arrangements, your timing. These are things we don't really think about in our work. We have, our trials. Yes, we may do naturalistic intervention, which is closer to not delivering an instruction, but it's slightly different. Even that needs to be better defined in our world. But there's an attention to detail, and there's a molecular analysis there. It's the moment-to-moment changes are all accounted for. I think that's what I would like to see. I would like to see behavior analysts who work with humans learn from behavior analysts who work with non-human learners. I think you all have a lot to teach us. We can contribute too, and I think, to be fair to my field, is we can provide the conceptual tools to explain the effectiveness of what you do in terms of controlling variables.
Well, I'm always worried when I create episodes about human learners. I'm like, do our audience want to learn about human learners, or they just want to talk about dogs? I totally embrace opportunities to explore my own curiosities, but I hope that our show can bridge the gap somewhat between the application of what we do between all learners. And if you're listening to this, then so do you. If you've reached this stage of the episode, no, we're grateful for that. Can you just share with everyone before we wrap up where they can go online to see your clinic, social media, get in touch? What's the best places for people to visit after listening to this episode?
Facebook, just my name, Francesca Degli Espinosa. The clinic's website is abaclinic.net. And it has actually some links to various videos of talks I've given in the past. If you want to delve into the dark realm of verbal behavior, that's pretty much it.
Wonderful. We will link to all of that in the show notes. This has been totally fun, Francesca. So thank you very much. Everyone listening, we record these back to back. So after our enjoyment of getting our microphones and headsets working, we've nearly been talking for 3.5 hours today. So a ton of gratitude to you, Francesca, for taking the time to sit down with me this evening in London and record these episodes. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
And to you for the opportunity. Thank you for inviting me.
And thank you so much for listening as well. This is your host, Ryan Cartledge, signing off from this episode of the Animal Training Academy podcast show. We hope today's conversation inspired you and equipped you with new tools for your trainers' toolbox. Remember, every challenge in training is an opportunity to learn and sharpen your animal training geekery. Embrace the rough patches, learn from them and keep improving. And don't forget, the path to growing your skills and expanding your knowledge continues beyond this episode. Visit www.atamember.com to join our supportive membership, where you will find a community of trainers just like you. Together, we're making a huge positive difference in the lives of animal and human learners worldwide. Until next time, keep honing your skills, stay awesome, and remember, every interaction with an animal or human learner is your opportunity to create ripples. We are here cheering you on every step of the way. See you at the next episode.